We have currently 15 people online, and especially many thanks to all of you from the French stream and the German stream, and also I see some year one students, and I still hope a few other people may be coming a bit later, I guess. We may have to try to talk a bit louder here because the acoustics are not ideal. So I hope, can you hear me in the back? Okay, wonderful. So online, at least you guys have the microphone here. So welcome to our first honors projects seminar, basically, that we ever hosted. So some of you don't really have that issue yet, the need to write an honors project in your final year, but maybe you're struggling, you don't know, well, what can I actually write about in an honors project? How can I approach it? What can I do? What is it even? Usually the last year is there to demonstrate to your professors, to your teachers, what you have learned, basically as a last conclusive work, as a last conclusive scientific paper. And usually it's like that, you write that thing, you submit it, you get it graded, and then you never hear anything about it ever again. So it may be somewhere in a desk or somewhere else on a shelf. So, however, I would like to give this a little bit more of a public approach here. So Manfred, he graduated this year, just a few months ago, in European Studies of the German stream. And the purpose of that seminar basically has several different purposes. So first of all, I would like to give Manfred some recognition of his work because he put a lot of energy, a lot of efforts in his research, and he did a very excellent job on that. Otherwise, I may not have invited him to begin with. Second of all, I would like to give him the opportunity to publicly show people what has he done. So what is his work about? How did he approach it? What may have been some issues, some problems he encountered in his research? Also, something you cannot value enough is literally experience, practice, try yourself out. And for Manfred, it's the first time. So I'm very glad that you're all here to support him on his very first public presentation. Don't get nervous. Okay, and last but not least, of course, offering you guys some support and giving you guys some ideas what you could potentially do in the future in your final year. The vision of that, and I have one message here already. Upload attendance record. Okay, about the CCL, we get back to that when we are done. So let's just get the seminar started. Thank you. So of course, the vision is to encourage you guys, maybe doing the same or doing something similar when you graduate. Maybe you have an excellent honors project and maybe you want to present it to the public. And this offer, of course, goes to the German stream and the French streams. And maybe we can also have a joint presentation one day with similar topics. Maybe there is a fellow German or French stream student that has similar topics and would like to present it all together. So this is something we can think about for the future. Of course, also another point is I want to encourage you to take part in future events from European Studies students, for European Studies students, from alumni, for students, or maybe likewise. Yeah, also a bit of a networking thing here. So feel free to chat with Manfred after the events and ask him anything you like. And as I said, ideally, this should be a kickoff for some potential series in the future. So maybe, hopefully, feel encouraged to do the same later on. But first of all, who are we? Of course, Manfred, he is a former German stream student from European Studies, and he graduated just last semester on the reconciliation agreement between Germany and Namibia. Does anyone know anything about that? Or why this is an issue? Oh, well, then I hope Manfred can enlighten you a bit in his presentation. He has been basically taking several different approaches on that. So there's a bit of history, there's a bit of politics in it. So maybe there's a little bit for all of you in this presentation. he will be accompanied, and any voice in zooming. Okay, oops, sorry, I didn't want to enlarge it. I should be acoustical. Can anyone else hear me? Well, while you're typing, I will just continue first. So Manfred will, of course, not be only by himself. He will be accompanied by my colleague, Dr. Scicluna, and she will add a little bit more of a general approach to that, and also add the perspective on third world approaches to international law. And I asked her, and I'm very happy that she agreed on joining us here, since she has a lot of expertise in international law. So I think we're going to have a very, very interesting and hopefully lively discussion after all. Okay. And yes, of course, I'm also there somehow as the moderator of this event. I will also moderate later on the Q&A after the presentation, after the sharing is over. This shall be it so far from my side. About you, so I would also encourage you to take maybe a few notes while you're listening to the presentation. So maybe you come up with some questions while you're listening to it that you want to ask to him later on. So there will be a Q&A in the end. Also for the people online, feel free to write questions in the chat already. I can also summarize them later on. Okay. So, and then I would say without any further ado, stage is all yours. The class is all yours. And you're welcome.
Do you want to try to like check the phone? I will check it. Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Sebastian, for such a wonderful introduction for me. As you already know, my name is Manfred. I'm a graduate from last year. I'm standing on this stage not just to present the theoretical knowledge of my honors project, but also the technical knowledge, the practicality of writing an honors project. So this is the agendas for today: introductions, my lens, some histories, and finally the crux of my honors project and the bibliography if you are interested in. So in this presentation, you not just hear about, again, the theoretical knowledge, but also I would describe as the emotional roller coaster of writing an honors project. In it, you would hear struggles, bottlenecks, anxieties, but also wonders and joys for finishing a daunting task. So let's begin with the background of my research. What are we talking about? Why is it important? So since its independence in 1990, Namibia has been trying to overcome its colonial past, from the renaming of streets to removal of statues from German colonial past of like colonial governor Kurt von François. However, as this presentation would see, the goals of German colonial past does not just manifest in physical objects, in streets names or in statues, etc. But what about on the other side, on Germans? I think some of you, and maybe two of our German lecturers here, know that in Germans, remembrance is very much part of German identity. To quote former German President Joachim Gauck, there is no German identity without Auschwitz. In fact, in Germans, they have the terms Vergangenheitsbewältigung, literally means coming to terms with the past, to struggle, to overcome the dark Nazi history that they own. As I've said, remembrance is such a core part of the German identity. And in fact, this is the beginning of my research, my interest of remembrance, of understanding and figuring out what the past means to people. And this is, to my dismay, the Holocaust is not the first genocide in German history. That would go to the genocide against the Oberherero and Namas in the beginning of the 20th century. And in fact, very recently, in 2021, the Germans and Namibians government reached an agreement over the reconciliation over the genocides. This reconciliation is the first of its kind, and this further sparked my interest in understanding how do Germany overcoming the past. And thus, we came to the topic of my research, Am Deutsche Wesen mag die Welt genesen, May the World Heal in German Character. This is a famous German poem by Immanuel Geibel. And the question is, does this reconciliation agreement, the first of its kind in human history against colonial crimes, heals the world, give justice to the victims? And thus, this framework, this daunting task needs a framework. And so we came to the core of my analysis, a post-colonial IR approach. Now, after understanding my interest and start beginning digging deep into my research topic, a framework is very important. A framework allows you to see the world through some lenses, gives you a grasp on reality, and allows you to slot in your analysis when you have a framework. Of course, understanding a framework and giving way to it requires a lot of reading, and a lot of reading, as you will see. I think it's worthy and it's very important. So, what is post-colonialism? What does international relations in post-colonialism entails? We'll explore here through the begin with the intellectual roots of Edward Said. But first, post-colonialism, defined by Encyclopedia Britannica, is defined as the concurrent project to reclaim and rethink the history and agencies of people subordinate under various forms of imperialism. What does it mean? Well, we're going to find out. So, in his seminal work, Orientalism, Palestinian-American scholars and cultural critic Edward Said describes and highlights the power relations between researchers and subjects, or in this case, Orientalists and Orients. The role between knowledge producers and the subjects to be studied are myriad in power relations that ultimately produces Orientalist tropes of the Easterner being mysterious, traditional, backwards. These Orientalist tropes and misrepresentation justified imperialist intervention into the region, and is sustained in ideologies and discourse of colonialist discourse. And thus, he presented an entangled relationship between power, knowledge, and of course, imperialism. He also, through his insights on Western domination of academia and the consequences of colonialism and imperialism on an intellectual level, he provided insights on Eurocentrism in the academic field. And from his viewpoints, spawned different ideas about how to overcome Eurocentrism. In, for example, Provincializing Europe by Dipesh Chakrabarty, which talks how we should not hold Europe as a center of enlightenment, progress, and modernity, or how modernity will experience very differently from the Europeans to the Latin Americans to even us. He also also is the intersection between culture and colonialism and identity. How, for example, the Blacks created the concept of Black Atlantic, which spawns as a legacy of the colonial slave trade and the triangular trade, or the indigenous people who were forced to be assimilated into a settler colonial society. And also another concept from post-colonial lens is the idea of subaltern, the lowest of low, those that were barely able to survive in a colonial power structures. Drawing from Antonio Gramsci's subaltern, centering the experience of colonialism on the subaltern, helped disrupt and dismantled the Eurocentrism in the academia. And thus we arrive at our lenses, post-colonial international relations. Post-colonial IR is a critique on the hierarchies as legacies of colonialism, of seeing the world through the Mycenaean worldview of the non-West and the West. It is also a critique on the Eurocentric historiography and concepts on IR in, for example, liberal democracy or international laws or periodization, and most importantly, the Westphalian system. Seeing Europe as the driver and architect of history and knowledge is very much the center critique for Eurocentrism in the field of IR. It also addresses the need to reconstruct IR from the point of view of the others, of the Orients, of giving voice to the marginalized and the silence in the colonial power structure. In short, is Japan saying the need to deconstruct, decenter, and decolonize IR. And from this, two major framework will be utilized in my honors project: post-colonial asymmetry and decolonizing methodologies. Post-colonial asymmetry describes the differences of power between the former colonizers and the former colonized as a legacy of colonialism. This, in my honors project, I talked about the Germans and Namibian relationship as very much one of this asymmetry, but it does not just manifest in the economic outcome of Germany as some of the most powerful economies, some would say great powers in the world, and Namibia, which is just a middle-aged country that is mired in poverty. But also on an intellectual level, where German civil society does not necessarily have to engage with its colonial past, while the people in Namibia is living through it day by day. Decolonizing methodologies was drew from the influence of Said talking about Eurocentric knowledge production, and through Linda Tahiwa Smith, she challenges the marginalization and exclusion on indigenous voices in the studying of the indigenous people, and calls for a shift from a framework between researchers and subjects into a more inclusive and mutually engaging framework. Basically, it is emphasizing on a politics of listening. By the act of listening to the experience of those that are subject under imperialism, we can understand their voices, disrupt and dismantle hierarchies in the modern academia. And thus, my honors project does not just include normal academic sources, but also an interview with an over-Herero activist. But you may ask, why this lens? Well, I think it is important for us. I assume most of you here are European studies students, so I think it's very important to understand the major underpinnings of the relations of Europe and the others, but also the condition that gives birth to our modern world, not just on an economic level, but also in our minds, in the intellectual level. And thus I will give you a little bit about the historical context of the genocide. So Germany established its presence during the Scramble of Africa in 1884 over a region that would be known as German Southwest Africa, and pursued a policy of settler colonialism. It sought to displace and push the over-Herero and Nama people into reservation. The shrinking living spaces of the over-Herero and Nama drove them into full-scale revolt in 1904, and German colonial forces in the region were proved to be incapable of handling the uprisings. And thus, German reinforcement led by Lothar von Trotha arrived in the region and pursued harsh tactics on the locals. issuing Vernichtbefehlung, extermination orders over the region, and also enslaving and capturing civilians in the region and putting them into concentration camps and enslaving them into infrastructure projects in Shark Islands Harbor. And as such, Lothar von Trotha issued the extermination order saying that every Herero would be shot and women and children would be driven back or shot. Basically, that's the extermination order. He also issued a similar proclamation to the Namas after putting down the over Hereros. In the end, 80% of the over Hereros population and 50% of the Namas population were exterminated after the genocide. And historians estimated around 80,000 people were killed during the genocide. After the genocide, Namibia fell into, after the First World War, Namibia fell into the South African mandate in administration. And ever since, the Over-Herero and Nama community has been struggling to reconstruct their communities. And in 1985, a Whitaker report in United Nations recognized the mass murders as genocide. In 1990, Namibia finally gained its independence, and for that, the Over-Herero and Nama community can finally come out and ask for the recognitions for genocide. In 2004, a speech by Haidemawe Ritsorek-So, a federal minister at that time, came to Namibia and delivered a speech talking about the recognition of genocide. In 2015, Germany and Namibia finally began a series of negotiations about the genocide and the reconciliation of it. In 2021, the Over-Herero and Nama community finally sees the end and the conclusion of the negotiation, and a joint declaration was signed. The consequence of this genocide was twofold. Of course, on a socioeconomic level, the population were decimated by the genocide. The lands were expropriated, and some members were expelled in German Southwest Africa, forming a large diaspora communities in neighboring country. Enslavement, many enslaved members were either killed or continue to be enslaved during the apartheid regime of South Africa. Today, Namibia saw itself as some of the most unequal society in the world, with a Gini index of 0.59. However, on a more intellectual level, on a more cultural level, the formation of diaspora communities and the fragmented communities does not bode well for them, because after Namibian independence, they are now forced to live in a country not of their own choosing, to forge a national identity not of their own. So, with the historical context over, allow me to run on also a bit of a tangent. I'm going into the analysis part, which is the more chunkier segment of this presentation, and also my honors project. This is a part where I start running into bottlenecks because of the gravity of this project, but also having to prepare the interview with the Over-Herero activists, with the coming to conclusion, but also some pent-up angers on how this negotiation was handled and understanding the general environment about it. I did take a break from writing this project, long one, not an easy one, I would say, because you are really guilt-tripped into writing this honors project. And basically I was saying, oh, I have to do it, but I don't have the strength to do it. But I think that taking care of your mental health is really important for writing such a daunting project for most of the students. I assume everyone is student here. I think taking care of your mental health is really important in finishing your honors project. and you are sort of rewarded after you finish the project, I would say. So after this tangent, let's go into the analysis part of my honors project. So in May 2021, Germany and Namibia finally reached an agreement in the reconciliation, in its negotiation, and signed united in remembrance of our colonial past, united in our will to reconcile, united in our vision of the future. Sounds wonderful. So what are the contents of this reconciliation agreement? First of all, Germany will recognize its moral and historical responsibility of the genocide, sorry, and apologize for the genocide it committed. Secondly, Germany promised a 1.1 billion financial aid over the span of 30 years that would be held in a joint government trust fund. And finally, a major point is that all monetary transfer, meaning that after this 1.1 billion development aid, Germany will be clear of its responsibility in the genocide. So that's basically some of the main points in this reconciliation agreement. Well, what was done right in this reconciliation agreement? Well, first of all, it is very much first of its kind in its history. We very few would heard about reconciliation between a former colonizers and the former colonized. You will rarely hear about the Belgians negotiating with the Congos for the gross colonial atrocities, or the British over all the way from Suez to the Cape of Good Hope to the people, or at least willingly, as we would talk about, or the French with the Vietnamese and the Algerians that experienced brutal repressions during its war of independence. If this reconciliation agreement was negotiated and done properly, it would have been a model for a very much a successful model between the former colonizers and the colonized to rectify the past mistakes that was done to the people and to redress the crimes that was done. A sincere apology could have repaired and fixed the relations between not just in an international level, but also in a national level. It echoes the title of my project of healing the world through the German character, of how Germans' initiative could have helped rectifying colonial past, colonial crimes. If that is a big if. And as we are going to go deeper into this discussion in this presentation, I will tell you what exactly went wrong with the reconciliation. So first of all, it is very much a Eurocentric reconciliation. If you know international relations, what is the defining moment for international relations? Well, the Westphalian system. What does the Westphalian system entail? States. The state-centric framework has always been a core of the field of IR. And in this reconciliation agreement, it is a bilateral agreement between Germany and Namibian government, and that lies the crux of the problem, because focusing on just the bilateral agreement between two states ignored and excluded non-state actors for the region, and as I will clarify later. To quote a communication report from Germany to the UN Human Rights Office, as the holder of national sovereignty, it is Namibian government's responsibility to organize the participation of all communities in the negotiation process, meaning that Germany's basically say, the problem in your states is your own, not my concern. However, without proper representation, how can it be a proper reconciliation for the Overherero and Nama? And this comes to the part of the problem is you would ask, well, what's wrong with the Namibian government then? Why can't they represent the Overherero and Nama people? Well, the Overherero and Namas, as I previously said, lived in a nation not of their own choosing. Namibia gaining its independence in 1990 is very much, yes, of course, they fought for it, but it is artificial. It is mirrored in various problems in regards to proper representation of the Overherero and Namas. Namibian Germans and white Germans, the settlers, the descendants of the settlers that we have talked about previously during the genocide, still very much hold around 30% of commercial farmlands, despite making up 6% of the population. They are generally wealthier and pretty much still hold political power in Namibia. Second of all, Namibia has an ethnic composition of 50% Ovambo people, while the Hereros and Nama people make up only around 20% of the population, making a Ovambo majority nation representing its ethnic minorities in negotiation for crimes not really committed to the Ovambo people really problematic to begin with. But also, many scholars have accused of the Namibian government to misappropriate and equating their struggles for independence with the genocide of the Overherero and Nama people, which the Overherero and Nama people, of course, protest because they are misappropriating the struggles of a very gross violations of human dignity. It is Namibia as a nation is very much a product of colonialism. Colonialism has and is still playing a big part in Namibian politics. Not only that, exclusively negotiating a bilateral agreement between Namibia and Germany also exclude the issue of diaspora. As we have mentioned, expulsion and refugees from the previous genocide found themselves settled down in neighboring nations such as the South Africa, Angola, and Botswana, for example. Not only that, the Overherero and Nama people have their own representation in the international stage. The various traditional authorities, the traditional leadership associations, and also the Nama Genocide Technical Committees, they are valid candidates for representing the Overherero and Namas on issues. Second of all, the problem is that Germany called its the money that would be given to the Namibian government as development aid rather than reparations. What is the problem with it? Well, development aid has the implications, and it was specified in the joint declaration that these development aid would be used in, for example, infrastructure development, construction projects, joint remembrance, and cultural exchange. In other words, the utilization of these funds are conditional. They are not given with no string attached. More of a problem is that Germany had been giving Namibia development aid since its independence, rather than saying the implication is that it is not really addressing the singular issues of the genocide, but rather as a more generosity, as a development aid of passing it like in the past. Moreover, it is also paternalistic and perpetuates a colonial power dynamic to say that, well, the Nama and Overhereros are experiencing poverty because well, they're poor, they're struggling. So let's give them money to develop, rather than the fact that they are poor today because of colonialism, because of the gross human rights violations by the Germans. So why is reparation important? Well, there are various United Nations declarations in regarding reparation as a fundamental rights for the victims of human rights violations. In, for example, United Nations Basic Principle and Guidelines on the Right to Remedy and Reparation for the Victims of Mass Gross Violation of International Human Rights Laws and Serious Violation of International Humanitarian Laws. Germany, in an attempt to rectify its colonial crime, emphasized on the historical and moral responsibility, but stopped short at a legal and financial one. Second of all, giving reparations to the Overhero and Nama people, giving them restitutions and satisfy the material needs of these communities by giving them monies unconditionally, serves to correct the historical injustice and allow the Overhero and Nama communities to develop wealth and accumulate wealth on their own accord. And finally, offering compensation with no strings attached shows that Germany is actually serious about rectifying atrocities and show themselves a genuine commitment in providing the Overhero and Nama a sense of justice to fix and repair the relationships. However, as we will see in this caricature, this is Namibia as a nation, and you see two graveyards of the Overhero and Namas, and this is German Foreign Secretary, well, then German Foreign Secretary Heiko Maas. The Namibian nation asked, "Are these reparations?" And Heiko Maas replied, "Well, not in my vocabulary. I can only use words like genocide, reconciliation, and reconstruction." And you see that he's holding 1.1 billion financial aid, as we have mentioned. In other words, Germany has been skirting around the issues of reparations for a long time, attempting to address the issues without actually addressing the issues. In fact, Heiko Maas, in a statement after the negotiation, said that no legal claims can be derived from the recognition of the genocide and subsequent negotiations. And thus, after going through the issues of the fundamentals of the reconciliations and the issues of reparations, we come to my most contentious point. In my view, Germany didn't actually confront the crimes that it committed, and they got the short end of the stick, I would say. So why would I say that? Well, the relationship of Germany and Namibia is one of post-colonial asymmetry, as I began this presentation with, one that is mirrored in power differences and cultural dynamic exists not just between this relationship, but also in Namibia itself, between the different ethnic groups of Namibia, of the white Namibians, the Ovambo, the Overhero, and Namas, and the various different kinds, the Sans, for example. By not engaging properly with this issue, it silences the perspective of Overhero and Namas. And the silencing of their voices is especially due to colonialism itself. Without any consideration of this dynamic in mind, any attempts to rectify colonial crimes would be inadequate at best, insincere at worst. And I would illustrate in the following few examples on the reason why I consider that. So in the first statement, Jews suffer more than Overhero and Nama a very strong statement, was between delegation meetings between the German delegations and the Nama Genocide Technical Committee. Not negotiation, a meeting, a briefing. In it, the Nama Genocide Technical Committees raised the issues of reparations and citing examples of the Holocaust of Germany dealing with the Jewish Claim Conference as a non-state actors for the issues of reparation, in which the German delegation promptly said the Jews suffer more than the Oberherero and Namas. In another instance, it is a closed door and very much underrepresented negotiations, focusing it on the bilateral agreement between the two nations, as we have mentioned, is mirrored in the problems of Namibia as a nation itself, how the artificiality of Namibia came to be and could fail to properly represent the Oberherero and Namas, but instead Germany exclusively negotiate with Namibia government, despite protests from activists in Germany and of course the Oberherero and Namas. In fact, the Oberherero and Namas currently is filing a lawsuit in Namibia in the Supreme Court over the issue of Namibian Parliament's representations of the Oberherero and Namas. In another instances, in the joint declarations, the apologies were signed already without even being issued out from the German government. This blanket acceptance of apology is very much an issue because you can't really say that you forgive others without first listening to what it has to say for its apology. It's very much inappropriate in a day-to-day basis, let alone between nations. Once again, we come back also in the final instance of the issue of reparations. The Oberherero and Nama people has been vehemently insisting on a reparation, on the issue of reparation, but instead Germany just keep dodging the issue, so to speak. Claiming historical and moral responsibility, but just stop short at a legal and financial one is not a good way to reconcile colonial atrocities. Therefore, I stated that the post-colonial asymmetry between Germany and Namibia has pretty much silenced and marginalized the voice of the Oberherero and Nama people. In short, I think it is an attempt to decolonize through means and framework that are still very much entangled and intertwined with colonialism. Finally, this is the conclusion of my honors project. To quote a paper, it is a missed opportunity. Despite it is a historical or monumental moment in the international stage, the structural problem in a world, the structural problem still exists in our world, and this reconciliation agreement still very much entangled in colonial power dynamics that fail to address the issue that it's trying to solve in its first place. The ignorance, the silencing, and the marginalization of the Oberherero and Nama's voices in these issues serves as a reminder that we still need a more inclusive and well-rounded reconciliations. And finally, a more personal note, this honors project is very much an intersection between my own interests on, as we have mentioned, politics, on power, on dynamics, on international relations as a whole. Of course, not all honors project has to be as grand as this ideal goals, but my point is that all honors project, if it is your own interest, if it is something that you want to be, it can be. an honors project, anything can be. This is some of my sources if anyone would be interested in. Thank you very much for coming here and listening to my rambling. And thank you, Sebastian, and also Nicole for coming and accompanying me on this journey of presenting my honors project. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Manfred. Thank you very much. So in case you have any questions, please keep them a little bit for yourself for now. So we go right ahead to Dr. Scicluna, who will give you a more general approach to that very topic. So any question you may have, please note it down and ask it to Manfred after her sharing. Share. Just close this one.
You just open the page.
Okay, so this one. Yeah. This one. Okay. So just click on share button. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And I have to start by saying thank you to Manfred for such an excellent presentation. Really, really detailed and thought-provoking. And I hope and I'm sure that it's helpful for all of you in thinking about what you may want to write about. And I would also start by echoing Manfred's very final point, right, that, you know, find a topic that really interests you and it will make a project that you have to write over a whole year, 2 semesters, right, much more enjoyable and much more meaningful. So that was excellent. Thank you. And thanks also to Sebastian for inviting me to participate. And thank you to all of you for being here to listen to our seminar. Now, so Manfred focused in great detail and gave us an excellent analysis of this particular case, which is the case of the reconciliation agreement between Germany and Namibia. And it is a very interesting case for many reasons, many of which Manfred discussed, including the fact that it's unprecedented, right, or certainly extremely unusual, right? What I want to do, I'm not going to focus actually on the specific case of Namibia. What I'll do in my brief response, and then we can get to the Q&A, is to zoom out a bit and focus more on the kind of broader context of international law and say a little bit about, well, as the title of my presentation has it, the problem of international law and colonialism. And what I hope to show, therefore, is that the shortcomings of the Namibia case, right, or the shortcomings, the power asymmetry, the fact that it's framed as aid rather than reparations, the fact that the negotiations took place between 2 states rather than between Germany and representatives of the descendants of the victims, all of these problems, you know, all of these problems occur in a context where you have an international law framework that basically does not account, is not able to account for colonial crimes, okay? And so that's how I state the problem, okay? Title my presentation, The Problem of International Law and Colonialism, and this is the problem, okay? The problem is this, that international law fails to address and fails to offer redress for legacies of colonialism. And so when you take that to a particular case like Germany and Namibia, what you have in the end, and I come back to this as my conclusion, but what you have in the end is that Germany is able to frame this as basically a noble gesture, right? A kind of charitable gesture. This is not something that Germany has to do. And then, you know, that goes along with offering a payment to Namibia, but in the form of aid, right? This is a charitable gesture rather than a kind of a reckoning with colonial crimes that is being forced on Germany. Okay, so Germany is voluntarily doing this, which makes it look like such a kind of noble humanitarian gesture. Okay, so this is the problem, that international law fails to address legacies of colonialism, and it does not offer redress. And I want to explain very briefly the main reasons why, okay? And in doing so, the approach that I'm using, so this is, Manfred talked a lot about post-colonial international relations and different post-colonial approaches. In the field of international law, there's a school of thought called TWAIL, that's an acronym. So TWAIL stands for Third World Approaches to International Law, okay? And so this is a kind of a post-colonial critique of international law. So TWAIL is a very kind of well-established body of scholarship that I think complements some of the post-colonial approaches of international relations, but this is in the field of international law. Okay, and what I have there on the slide, I have a quote from Mikhail Matua, who is one of the leading TWAIL scholars, okay? And this is from a talk he gave, and it was written up as a journal article, and he gets right to the point, okay? The regime of international law is illegitimate. It is a predatory system that legitimizes, reproduces, and sustains the plunder and subordination of the third world by the West. So this is extremely strong critique of international law. And I highlight it. I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever studied international law or even thought about it, but I've been teaching international law for many years here in Hong Kong, and before that in the UK, right? And usually I would start those classes at the start of the semester by asking the students, what do you think about international law, right? And these, again, people who mostly have never studied it. And by far and away, the most common reaction would be, well, it's meaningless. It's meaningless. It's weak. Basically, the realist critique, what you could call the realist critique. I mean, law doesn't matter, power matters. Just look at the world. Just look at the world. What matters is power. This is far and away the most common critique of international law. Okay. So what's interesting about the TWAIL critique is that it kind of turns that on its head, because the most common critique, the realist critique, is, well, international law is just meaningless. It's just window dressing. States do what they want and law doesn't constrain them, okay? But the TWAIL critique points out that that's not exactly true. That's partly true. Powerful states do what they want. Powerful states do what they want. But international law in the hands of powerful states and used against particularly third world states can be a very powerful tool indeed. Okay, so that's the TWAIL critique, actually. It's not that international law is useless. From this perspective, it's actually worse than useless, right? It's actively damaging, actively harmful, in that it can be used, it can be wielded by the powerful against the weak. It can be used to justify certain actions by the powerful against the weak, okay? Okay, so, and again, in this presentation, I'm going to draw from TWAIL scholarship and TWAIL critiques of international law, right, focusing on this problem of colonialism. All right, so coming back to it, international law and the problem of colonialism, and we can identify 1945 as a watershed year, okay, as a kind of turning point, a key year, okay? Why 1945? I'm sure you all know that that's the end of the Second World War, okay? 1945 is the end of the Second World War, and it was the end of the Second World War. You have the signing of the UN Charter and you have the creation of the United Nations. So in terms of international law, 1945 is a real before and after year, right? Before and after. And basically, if we teach international law now, we're essentially teaching post-1945 international law, okay? So now, before and after. If I can briefly explain what I mean by the problem of international law and colonialism with the before and after, I'm not really going to talk about pre-1945 now, but of course, prior to 1945, international law actively legitimized European colonialism. Okay, and this goes right back to the conquest of the Americas, right? You know, in hundreds of years ago. So from the conquest of the Americas at the beginning of the age of European exploration, all the way up to the 19th century and the early 20th century, international law essentially legitimized European colonialism, particularly by making a distinction between European states, which were civilized sovereign states, and non-European peoples, polities, which were not. And this is obviously a judgment made by Europeans themselves, right? That non-Europeans don't organize themselves in ways that Europeans recognize as sovereign states. Therefore, this is basically land, territory that belongs to no one. In Australia, where I'm from, this manifested in the doctrine of terra nullius, right? Terra nullius means empty land, empty land. Now, of course, the land was not empty, and even the people who colonized it didn't actually literally believe or spread the idea that it was empty. Of course, there were indigenous people there. But empty in terms of, well, it doesn't belong to them because they don't conquer the land, they don't organize the land, they don't govern the land in a way that we recognize, right? So we'll go ahead and do that, okay? So right up until 1945, international law essentially legitimizes European colonialism. Namibia itself provides a good example of that. How is it that Namibia didn't become an independent state until 1990? Well, it had, of course, been a German colony, German Southwest Africa. Germany lost its colonies at the end of the First World War, okay, as punishment for losing the First World War. Germany lost its colonies. What happened to the German colonies, right? Were they given their independence? No. They were given to mostly they were given to either the UK or France. Sorry, this also goes for the Ottoman Empire, right? So the Ottoman territories in the Middle East and German colonies, many of them were given to be governed either by Britain or by France. Papua New Guinea was given to Australia, and Namibia was given to South Africa. Okay, apartheid South Africa. And so it wasn't until the fall of the apartheid regime and the end of the Cold War, issues to do with the Cold War, that Namibia actually gained its independence. Okay, so that system, these were called mandates. The former colonies were mandates, right? And they were, as I said, given to administer by other powers on the paternalistic justification that these people were not capable of governing themselves. This was very explicitly the reason. Okay, these people are not civilized enough, they're not experienced enough, they're not capable of governing themselves, okay? So they're given as mandates. And in the case of Namibia, that meant becoming a South African mandate until 1990. Okay, so that's the bad old days, okay? 1945 then is the turning point, and the UN Charter definitively outlaws aggressive war and the acquisition of territory by conquest or annexation. So, okay, great. At least those things are no longer legal. Not to say they don't still happen, right? Which is, again, the realist critique of international law, right? Again, just look at the world. Aggressive war happens. Acquisition of territory by annexation doesn't happen as much as it used to, but it still happens. Okay, but still, at least now we can say these things are clearly illegal. But why is it that this still doesn't really help former colonies? It's mainly because these are, of course, forward-looking doctrines, okay? So aggressive war is illegal since 1945, right? Acquiring colonies, conquering colonies is illegal after 1945, okay? So it doesn't work backwards, that things that happened before 1945 are now illegal, okay? And I'll come back and say a bit about that. Now, in terms of political decolonization, and I just here mean in a narrow sense, right? Because decolonization, what it actually means is complicated and controversial, but in a political sense, we can just say, well, it's colonies gaining independence, right? Colonies becoming independent states. So in that sense, decolonization is kind of the force, the movement of the second half of the 20th century, right? It's the movement that defines post-1945. And you can, in a very straightforward sense, you can track the progress of political decolonization by looking at UN membership. Okay, so from 51 founding member states in 1945, of which 37 were non-European, those 37 were mostly in Latin America. Okay, mostly Latin America, because those countries had mostly gained their independence in the 19th century. Okay, so there weren't many Asian or African countries. But you see this exponential growth, okay? So 1965, 117, more than double, and up to today, 193, okay? So that's the basic fact of political decolonization, okay? So then in that narrow sense, you can say, well, it's a success story, right? The UN Charter outlawed colonization, and since then, you've got these waves of colonies gaining their independence, which is true in one sense, but, and this is again where the Twale critique comes in, and I think Manfred really helpfully highlighted some of these issues, right? Like power asymmetries. Who is actually the government of the state? Who does the state speak for, right? So who actually controls the resources of the state? And do they really represent the people who totally arbitrarily and randomly ended up in that state, right, because of the way the borders were drawn. So the most basic point is just the first one, okay, that political decolonization doesn't mean returning to how the world was before colonization, which is obviously actually just impossible anyway, right? That would be impossible. So there is no return to the status quo ante. So status quo ante just means the way things were before. That's not really possible, of course. Fundamentally, and I suppose this is a key point of this presentation, and it echoes Manfred's point, the world we live in is the one that was made by colonization, and there's no changing that. You can't go back on that. And so trail scholars point out that, well, yes, it's one thing to get, in a formal sense, sovereignty, right, independence. So Namibia in 1990, in a formal sense, is an independent state, in a formal sense. In any kind of substantive, realistic sense, Namibia is obviously not the equal of Germany, right, or any number of other states, right, in terms of its political power on the world stage, in terms of its economic weight, and so on and so forth, okay? So what are some of these constraints? I just want to, highlight a couple. So the first one there, uti posseditis, don't be put off, it's a Latin phrase. It means as you possess, and what it means practically speaking is that when colonial states become independent, they become independent within their colonial borders. This is already a problem, right? And Manfred talked about it in relation to Namibia. So the survivors of the Nama and the Ovaherero, right, the survivors of the genocide, their descendants, they're not all neatly within these arbitrary borders of what randomly becomes Namibia, right? The diaspora is spread over many African countries, and then they're totally left out of a process, right, that's done bilaterally between Germany and Namibia. This is a huge problem, right? And you wouldn't know about this, but for example, when Nigeria gained its independence, within what arbitrarily became Nigeria, of course, there were many different ethnic groups. And one of them, the Biafrans, almost immediately tried to push for their own independence, right? They considered themselves a distinct people, a distinct nation. And so they tried to push for the independence of their Biafran nation. This was extremely brutally put down. It's actually out of this that the organization Doctors Without Borders is created, because the Red Cross was there basically witnessing the atrocities committed by the Nigerian government against the Biafrans. And the Red Cross has a strong doctrine of, we work with everyone and we just try to help everyone, and we're not going to kind of strongly criticize the Nigerian government for what they're doing. So the doctors who broke away to form Doctors Without Borders felt they couldn't do that, that they had to bear witness to the truth of what was going on. The point is that Nigeria brutally put down that attempt at independence for Biafrans with the support of the United Nations and the European countries and the former colonial powers, because this was the principle, right? Yes, you can have your independence, but only within these borders, right? Only within these arbitrary borders. So you combine that arbitrary borders with the second point, right? A nation state as winner takes all. And this is very much a Eurocentric legacy. Who controls the state controls all the resources. And again, when you have different groups who are kind of thrown together, right? And Manfred said in Namibia, you have different tribal groups, including groups that were not affected, the majority group that was not affected by the genocide, okay? So if they control the offices of the state, they don't necessarily speak for the ethnic minority groups or the tribal minority groups. And this has been an issue in many, this is also actually, if you look at the situation in Myanmar and the treatment of the Rohingya, right? It's because the state is winner takes all, right? And the state is controlled by, by the Burmese majority group that just do not see a place for the minority nation, right? Just do not conceive them as being Burmese and as belonging to that state. There is no place for them. Okay. The other point I'm not going to emphasize now because I want to keep it brief, but the point is that the last one, okay? When these countries gain independence, the playing field is already uneven, and international law tips the balance further, okay, with doctrines that favor former colonizers over former colonies, okay? In terms of erasing European culpability, there's just a couple more points I want to make. One I already mentioned, which is non-retroactivity, okay? So you have it that, yes, now it's illegal to have colonies, right? But that doesn't redress the situation before 1945. And it's the same in a way with genocide. So the Genocide Convention was ratified in 1948. So we can use the word genocide to describe things that happened before 1948. But the Genocide Convention doesn't, apply, right, like other treaties and legal instruments. It's a forward-looking document, okay? So non-retroactivity. Non-retroactivity, if you don't know, just means that laws, right, from the day they're passed, apply from the day they're passed and not before. Now, generally, of course, this is a good thing, right? This is positively associated with the rule of law, right? Because it would be grossly unfair in most cases to prosecute you for doing something that was not a crime when you did it. Okay, so this is a very basic principle. If a new law is passed, okay, this is the new law, you have to abide by it, but you shouldn't then be arrested for things you did previously, right? It should only apply to the future. So generally, non-retroactivity is a good thing. It's a positive thing. But in this case, it makes it difficult to address past injustice, okay? And, why was it designed this way? And you had this kind of, this picture is from the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal of leading Nazis, right? And there you had the kind of difficulty of, on the one hand, the Allied powers very much wanting to secure the convictions of the Nazis and establish that what they had done is criminal, but in a way that would not implicate themselves and especially would not implicate the European powers. I don't have time to go into it, but just one point where this was kind of most obviously difficult is not so much at Nuremberg, where there were difficulties, but in Tokyo, right? Because the leading Nazis and also the Japanese who were tried in the Tokyo Tribunal were charged with crimes against peace. They were charged with waging aggressive war. Problematic in both cases. But in Tokyo, at this very time, right, you have the French trying to violently re-establish their empire in Indochina, right? So it's bad and criminal when Japan does it, kind of not when European countries do it. I mean, how does this exactly work, right? So, and especially if it's, going to be applied retroactively. So that was especially controversial, and especially at Tokyo. And so it suited, of course, the European powers by and large to not pursue past crimes, right? To not try to retroactively press these charges. And then you have the fact of limited scope, and Namibia could be a case of this. Myanmar is a case of this. There are many cases of this, but just to explain what I mean, I choose Rwanda. So you may know that in Rwanda there was a genocide in 1993. Okay, sorry, in 1994. And Rwanda is another case where, it's a former colony, it's created within arbitrary borders, and you have different ethnic groups. And in that case, you had the majority of the population who were the Hutus, and a minority group, there were more than one minority group, but a minority group called the Tutsis. Now, during the colonial period, and this was, of course, a very common tactic that European powers used in their colonies, was divide and rule. So where you have different ethnic groups, often the colonial rulers would favor one ethnic group and reward them with civil servant posts, or the entire police force would be drawn from one ethnic group, right? And then they would be usually a minority group. And then you would have a minority group policing the majority. And this is what the Belgians did in colonial and Rwanda. So they very much favored the Tutsis. The Tutsis, therefore, even though they were a minority, were wealthier, and disproportionately controlled the state, right? After Rwanda gained independence, the majority group, the Hutus, took over the state, okay? And so this is the broader context that leads to the genocide. But when it comes to actually turning this into a crime that can be prosecuted, you see that the framing is very narrow. So everything that happens before 1994 is considered irrelevant for the criminal proceeding, okay? And then what you're left with is, these Africans, always fighting each other for reasons we'll never quite understand. And, we, the West, the United Nations, we need to try to come in, and we need the peacekeepers, and we need the tribunal, and we need to sort it out. And look, they can't govern themselves. They were probably actually better off being a colony, right? But, the entire colonial context that created the genocide is excluded from that view. Yeah. Okay. I've been talking for too long, so I come to my conclusion. And again, if I come back to Mikhail Matua, And he has a very provocative turn of phrase. It's actually in relation to international human rights law, where he talks about this savage victim savior metaphor, right? And the Rwanda example is like that, right? So that in international law helps to construct narratives where non-Westerners either appear as savages, right? So the barbaric perpetrators of atrocity crimes, or as victims, right? The helpless victims of atrocity crimes. And Westerners tend to appear as the saviors, right? They come in with the peacekeepers and the UN and the post facto, international criminal tribunals, okay? And there are echoes of that in the Germany-Namibia agreement. So my final point, right? International law doesn't oblige Germany to take responsibility for a genocide that happened at the start of the 20th century. And therefore, Germany can frame it as an act of generosity, okay? Free from legal consequence, as an act of charity, okay? But as Manfred explained in great detail and very convincingly, genuine reconciliation would require going beyond that kind of Eurocentric, state-centric international law framework. Okay, and I'll finish there. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you, Nicole. Okay, does anyone have questions to our two speakers today? Certainly also Manfred. Also, the same question goes to anyone online. Yes?
Thanks very much. Nicole, when you talked about the international you on the terminology you used, the international law legitimizes EU colonization. Do you see a difference between legitimize in this context and does not address? Because I was wondering why the term legitimize is used. I would associate with it that the international law is dealing with something and then is giving a green light to it instead of does not address. Why is it legitimized?
Okay, thanks. I don't know if this is working. Yeah, thanks. Just to clarify on that, legitimize only applies to before 1945. So before 1945, international law actively gives a green light to it, right? After 1945, it does not legitimize, it just does not properly address. So that's the kind of before and after. But before 1945, it does legitimize, and for example, in giving former German or Ottoman territories as colonies to other countries. And I didn't go into it, but going back, as I said, to the Spanish conquest of the Americas, and this is before, like, arguably you can't even call it international law, right? You can call it the European Law of Nations. But kind of these ideas about Europeans having a right to trade, having a right to preach Christianity, having a right to punish native peoples who try to stop them or interfere with them trading or preaching Christianity. These things, were used to legitimize colonization. But yeah, that's before 1945, not after.
Is there any question from the students, perhaps? I mean, you're probably very curious. There's a question? Yes? I can also just repeat it for you. So
I was wondering, like, for the speaker, at the end you mentioned about like having a more inclusive and more like well-rounded reconciliation, but I was wondering, like, how is that really achievable in reality? Because again, I think it's easier to cater to the majority of the people rather than like the minority.
Thank you for your questions. I think that genuine reconciliation would be, well, at least I think that the problem is that Germany did not even attempt to try to negotiate with the indigenous people, the Ovaherero and Nama people in this scenario. They just see the Namibian state and then just say, hey, let's do it then. And yes, the need for the road to reconciliation is very difficult, I think, because of course the Namibian states would say that, hey, this is our internal affairs. Why is the German state interfering with our own affairs in our own national politics? But I think that for starters, the Namibian state itself maybe should have included their voices, but also Germany should also do that as well. I think that would be a starter. Yeah. I hope it answers your question.
I guess.
Thanks for sharing. So I think it's a very interesting topic to talk about the recognition, the conversations between the Japanese and Namibia. So when you talk about the concept of colonizations in Africa, it's quite tragic, especially the Springboard of Africa. It just talk about power, how to divide Africa into several areas, and after the decolonization, they just let the colonized to draw the lines of what is the country established about, and they didn't care about the ethnicities. So let me ask some question about the protection. And do you feel like the reconciliation will become examples for other different countries to claim its compositions from the original colonized government? And the second question is the memorized culture in Germany is a tool to expand its influence, or it's just a yeah, and what I mean is it a culture, or is it a tool to use it to expand its diplomatic power?
Thank you for the question. Well, again, I want to say that remembrance as a German culture is very much a unique phenomenon especially in a European setting. I think that in terms of, for example, addressing this, for example, when we talk about the cultural phenomenon of overcoming its past, it was for the Holocaust very much aimed at reconciling and attempting to remember the past on the Nazis and the Holocaust. And I think it's genuine because, as you would see, a lot of lectures, a lot of memorial sites as I've visited in Germany talks about this very, very a lot. And I think it's a good thing. I think your question also touched on something that I've read regarding the genocide against the Ovahereros and the Namas and the Holocaust. Is that in historians' discussions in historiography, there is a framework known as the continuation thesis, which talks about how many tactics, influences, or the ideologies that were utilized or justifying imperialism manifest itself in the Holocaust. I think that's a very interesting aspect that not many people have talked about before. And I think that is something that was worthy to be studied and discussed. And in fact, I think sometimes not comparing the Holocaust to anything, but I think that there are also other genocide and historical events that are worthy to be remembered, but I don't think it is or was utilized as a tool to leverage for influence, I think. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so we have one question online from someone you may know. Has there been any consensus established about what constitutes a proper repatriation it is difficult to
Actually,
examine.
reparation.
Huh?
A proper reparation.
Is it repatriation?
Thinking it's
Reparation. It is difficult to examine whether the reparation or repatriation. Can you could clarify if you mean repatriation or reparation is appropriate done or not without a clear standard?
I think also that links to teacher's other question, which was about whether this could serve as an example to others. Like, is there a gold standard of reparation of grievance? And could the German Namibia one serve as an example to others?
Well, I think that reparation. Okay, yeah. I think I don't think there is any, because all crimes against humanities and colonial atrocities are different in its own scope and own understanding in many ways. And I think that there shouldn't be any, because and then the other groups can just say, hey, what about us? You know, I think that it should be discussed in a case-to-case basis. That's just my own opinion. But yeah, yeah, that's my opinion for now. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions online or here in the room? I mean, I have one question on that. I mean, yes, is there a question? We can still think about it. Maybe asking one first. Manfred, a lot of Germans, I mean, if you ask them, like if you come up with the question on, well, colonialism, colonies, this is so long ago. I mean, we are always blamed for World War II and so on. So, and a lot of Germans would argue, well, we've done enough. Do you think Germans have done enough in terms of reparations or in terms of reconciliation?
I think that, well, for starters, it is a crime, so it should have been paid, at least for like paying. Not saying that human lives can be evaluated, but that you know, crimes were done, and so you have to give the victims a sense of justice. You have to give them back something. And this speaks of also about the discussion on whether or on touch on why development aid is a problem, because land reform has been in vibrant discussion in Namibia, with the white Namibians holding very much 30% of the profitable farmlands, despite making up 6% of the populations. It was justifiable for the overheroes and Namas to demand that we live in poverty. Our lives were defined by the intergenerational traumas that were done because of Germany. And also, we cannot forget the fact that wealth can be are often accumulated intergenerationally. So stripping away a wealth for some people a long time ago, even just, for example, 50 or 20 years, can have a snowballing effect that can still affect people who are living today. And so I think that it is important to address these crimes in the past, because as we have seen, the structure of the modern world we see today is it's because of colonialism. And what essentially is colonialism? It is exploitation. It is expropriation of land, of property, of people. And you know, we have to address that fundamental issues in order to give the world a sense of justice. That's what I thought.
Maybe picking up that point and maybe playing it to Nicole a bit. Basically, regarding former colonial powers, do you think there is or should be any obligation towards the former colonies? When Manfred said, well, it had a snowball effect. Is there, like, in 1949 is basically like the line where you draw the line, basically, but what about, let's say, I mean, if you even go further, 500 years, the Spanish people, the conquistadors in South America or Middle America, and there may have been there was an apology from the Pope even. Do you think this kind of apology was necessary, or was it even enough? Should there be other things being followed by that? I mean, a lot of wealth from the church originates from there as well.
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, I echo Manfred that it's obviously so complicated that it's hard to kind of say, well, there could be easily one framework or one gold standard. And in a way, you would have to account on a case-by-case basis, because also, again, you'd have to be saying, okay, well, say the church, needs to pay reparations. Well, to whom, right? Because like the inheritors of the state of Mexico and so on, right, not necessarily the native people, right, but they also just reflect kind of generations and generations of descent from the Spanish colonizers, right? And obviously it's a very long time ago, so now this is very mixed. So, who is the state? Who represents the state? Who speaks on behalf of different groups? It really would have to be done on a case-by-case basis, right? And then you would have the difficulty of having appropriate, so Manfred explained in the Namibian case, there are organizations that represent the Nama and the Ovaherero, but this itself could be complicated, right? So even the Nama and the Ovaherero, who authentically speaks for them or on their behalf? And it would be the same in all other cases. So whether an apology is enough, again, this is something that is an ongoing issue in Australia in relation to Indigenous people. And there are lots of things to apologise for. A former Australian Prime Minister now, gosh, a long time ago, longer than I want to think about, did give an apology for one aspect of something that was done to Indigenous Australians, right? But it was very much like, guys, this is just going to be an apology, right? You're just getting an apology. There's going to be no compensation attached to that, which is often the problem, right? But then, you get into, so ideally there should be some kind of framework for redressing these wrongs, but it's hard to see how there could be something that would be one size fits all, right? And how you could get that. And also, practically speaking, realistically speaking, there's not going to be an international law treaty along these lines because the relevant countries would not support it. So there's that kind of practical.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe one question to Manfred. I mean, Nicole talked about bits about the borders have been drawn by the colonizers. And I think back in history, like the Berlin Conference, for example, basically what they've done was taken a ruler, draw a line, and then that's how you got the border. Has there been any attempts in Namibia to rectify this in some way?
Well, the Namibian government did recognize the flora of regional entities that represents the Ovaherero and Nama communities. For example, the Nama Traditional Leaders Association, for example, or the more forward-spoken association is the Ovaherero's Traditional Authorities, which trace its lineage to some of the leaders that fight against the Germans. For example, in the colonial war, it traces lineage from Samuel Maherero, for example. And it is a very difficult discussion because, again, as I've said in the presentation, some scholars have been saying that the Namibian government tried to equate its struggle and the formation of the national identities with the struggle of the Namas and Ovahereros in its struggle for recognizing its genocide, rectification of the colonial crimes, etc., etc. And so for all of the groups in Namibia, it is still a very difficult discussion.
Thank you. Any question maybe from the audience? Any further question here? Or from the people online? Is there like a maybe?
Yeah, I can answer.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you think this action of Germany, of, supporting financial aids instead of reparations? I don't actually care about the terms. I care about actions actually. So you think like this action made by Germany is actually because of its history background of being, the starters of 2 world wars, and those consequences to bear, a lot of guilt to bear. So that's why we need to do something in order to repay its debts. Unless if you look at other countries, victorious countries in the 2 world wars, like Britain, France, USA, they actually did a lot more. They have a lot more colonies, right? They export more people as well, but they did nothing. Or they don't even have financial aid as much as Germany paying for the Namibia peoples. Do you think it's because of the historical backgrounds? So that's why the Germany had to do something drastic by comparing to other nations, such as Britain, France.
I think that's a very valid question, as I have discussed in the introduction part of the presentation, that yes, German people did struggle with the guilt and the associations of the Second World War. It's very dark historical past, and I think yeah, it could have certainly played a role in the reconciliation. But I think that's the problem is that the issues on German colonies. I think that the Germans here can say that it's not, there are no like memorial sites or like places or even plaques saying that here is where the German colonists set out. This is bad, and so I think it could have played a part, but remembering the Holocaust is very much a very forefront issues for the Germans rather than remembering colonial crimes. Instead, I would say that the Namas and Over Herero activists played a huge part and has been striving since Namibian independence. And in fact, not just since the Namibian independence, since they gained, the transfer of German Southwest Africa into South African hands, they have been trying to reconstruct their own communities. Because, as we have said, expulsion, expropriation, and forced relocations by the German hands has fragmented their communities. And they have been struggling to have their issues being the centerpieces of their communities and the international stage as a whole. They have attempted to, funny thing, well, not really funny, but the Over Herero's people has been trying to sue Germany through a United States court, but of course, United States court struck down the cases because you cannot sue another country through our court system. But I think these highlights the issues of the long, arduous struggle of the Over Herero and Nama people in their recognition and the reconciliation. Yep.
Can I just add to that? Sorry, just a couple of points. Just firstly, that obviously, like many European countries do give a lot of aid to their former colonies, right? Whether or not it's enough is a different question. But of course, European countries, France, the UK, and so on, do maintain a special sort of relationship with their former colonies. As for why Germany has done the symbolic aspect, then I think it probably is linked to this special role of memory culture. Just on the last point, the US for a long time had this Alien Tort Act, which actually meant that you basically could sue anyone in a US court, including foreign governments. And this was happening too much, so they changed it. But it happened actually a lot, that this was actually a forum. You could sue like the Salvadorian government for torture of dissidents in the 1980s in a US court, right? And people were doing this. But I don't know all the details, but they actually changed it because it was becoming too much of a forum for anyone to sue anyone, which was not really what the US was trying to do.
Again, another question as well. I don't actually know this specific locations of Namibia's. When you're doing this this project, have you looked on other countries to be near Namibia's or in Africa as a comparison, or colonies, right? Former colonies. You do researches on other countries, near Namibia's, also former colonies, of the European countries as well. And any actions? Have you do comparison between Namibia's and others nations, or you just focus on Namibia's to address your opinions about whether you think the Germany action was actually valid?
Thank you for more technical questions. Yes, I did, but not a very in-depth one. I did research on for example, in the British, when the Kenyan during the Kenyan emergency in the 1960s, many activists and independence fighters were killed, tortured by the British colonial government and administrations. Why I did this is because I want to say that reparation is possible because the descendants of these Kenyan fighters, no, actually the survivors of the Kenyan fighters, sue the British Foreign Secretary in a British court, and they won. And the British Foreign Secretary has to pay reparations to these Kenyan fighters. So I think, yeah, so I did look about cases in these issues, but not really in depth, I would say.
Yeah, follow-up questions as well. By comparison with Kenya, because you have survivors in Kenya still, and doing this research, is there any survivors during this massacre, or the numbers of deaths? Is it the numbers of deaths? Is it close between with comparison with Kenya? How many people are dead in Kenya, so that the reparations are possible? Or because you mentioned there's 85,000, right? Is it 85,000? Somewhat, yeah, around 85,000 people were massacred in this situation. And is there any survivors? And is the numbers, comparison with Kenya, is it possible for reparations with them? For them. Yes.
So first of all, it would be the difficulty of time because this massacre happened centuries ago, more than a century ago already. It happened between 1904 to 1908. So very much any survivors would be around 120 years old. So it would be difficult to say. Therefore, when I speak with over Herer's activists, they are the descendants of survivors. They are very much speaking on the Kenyan cases. The Kenyan emergencies happened around I think the 50s and 60s. So it would not be really hard to find survivors of the incident and then sue the British court about it. But I did not use, I compared these two cases to highlight the issues of reparation, that yes, colonial atrocities and even genocide should warrant reparations. That's why I used the Kenyan emergency case to illustrate this point, for example. So I hope that answers your questions.
Is there a question? Okay, can you take it?
It is about a subjective question. So you mentioned about this comparison should not be used by money to balance with the injustice, as you talk about Namibia to have I would call it massacres or something like kill a lot of people, and you just take compensations as to compare those victims' families. Do you feel is a very moral compensations as just giving an act or giving compensation with money to represent their sorry or their mistakes in their history, or do you think there is a worthy actions to take in order to represent or compensation with those victims? It's a very subjective question. I think internationally it's very difficult to do for instead of the money, right?
In my presentation, I mentioned on a very long declaration, United Nations basic principle and guidelines on the rights to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violation of international human rights and serious violation of international humanitarian laws. In these declarations from United Nations, it mentions, I specifically mentioned this is because that it mentions that reparation is a right, but also this declaration did not just mention reparations or money. It also mentions that a sincere apology for saying sorry for the past that we have done, but also any support, be it emotional support to fix the intergenerational trauma, a dynamic shift of the power in the power differences between Germany and Namibia. And also, I think it's important is that I forgot to mention this in the presentation, but after killing the Overhero and Namas, some of the remains, be they died in the concentration camp or the mass murders that were shot, some of the bodies were sent back to Germany to prove the racial superiority of Germans. And the activists have been, well, since then, around last decade, their remains have been repatriated back to Namibian hands. But also, I think that recovering and returning artifacts, for example, that have been looted is also a very important scope in rectifying these gross atrocities, I think. So I would encourage you to maybe read more about these declarations because it is a very, very long document.
Thank you very much. I take it as there's no further question, I guess. I mean, there's one last thing actually that I have for Manfred, basically also from the two of us, basically just a little token of appreciation basically from us. So and also to all of you, like if you want to participate in this later on, and let's say in 2 years, hopefully you may be encouraging. You may also get a little something. So from Manfred, so just a little token of appreciation. So you can just put it to your references as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Manfred. And to all of you, thank you so much for coming. Thanks so much for all of your questions, of course, and also to those people online. Thank you very much. It's much appreciated. So.